What I think would have happened to the characters in High School Musical if they were real people. Sharpay would move to New York City immediately and audition for a ton of musicals. She'd get cast as a young Carol Baskin in an off-Broadway musical production of Tiger King Live. She'd then move to LA and narrowly lose the part of Betty Cooper in Riverdale to Lily Reinhart, and then she'd give up and marry rich. Taylor would go on to get her doctorate in aerospace engineering. She'd also be the youngest director ever hired at NASA. She'd spearhead a campaign to rename Pluto a planet, and she'd also single-handedly fix the ozone layer. Taylor would go on to play Division III college basketball, quickly realize that being the star of a singing and dancing high school's basketball team doesn't carry much weight in the real world. He'd get upset with not being idolized anymore, move back to his hometown, marry at the age of 25, have 2 kids, pressure them both to play basketball, and then live vicariously through them. What I think would have happened to the characters in High School Musical if they were real people. Part 2. Ryan would study musical theater in college. He'd inevitably cheat on Kelsey with an older gentleman in an unmarked van behind the local Circle K. He'd then move to West Hollywood, California, develop some bad habits because he was holding his true self in for so long, but he'd pull himself out of it, become a big shot Hollywood producer, finally produce the Wicked movie starring Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth that we've all been waiting for, and then he'd move to Palm Springs. Gabriella would become a big shot lawyer. She'd single-handedly take on the big oil industry and completely abolish it for green energy, and she would destroy the for-profit prison program. She would become the first Secretary of Renewable Energy of the United States, and then she'd save the Barrier Reef just because she wanted to. He would go on to study business and become a boring 9-to-5 business guy, but he would have the self-reflection to realize that he peaked in high school, so he'd take up yoga and meditation, and inevitably realize that he's actually bisexual, and the only man that he's ever had true feelings for was Ryan, because let's be honest, that I Don't Dance scene was very tense. Then he'd move to Los Angeles, California, find Ryan, take him on several dates, then they'd fall in love and move to Palm Springs. This is what I think would happen to the characters in High School Musical if they were real people. Part 3. Kelsey would go on to study music composition in college. In her first week, she'd meet a girl named Pepper, and they'd share a romantic kiss at a vegan club initiation party. Kelsey would then call Ryan, and they both have a very emotional phone call where they come out to each other. Kelsey would then go on to study under Andrew Lloyd Webber, and she'd work heavily on the Cats movie and be distraught when it bombed, but she would go on to write a musical about her and her friends' experiences in high school called High School Musical. Martha would go on to study business, not because she wanted to, but because she thought it was the safe bet. She'd then move home to Albuquerque and fall victim to a ton of multi-level marketing schemes, including LuLaRoe leggings. She'd realize her life was nothing what she wanted it to be, and use her business skills to open a dance school called Pop, Lock, Break, and Jam, and she trained some of Beyonce's future backup dancers. Zeke would go on to open a bakery called Love & Oven that would be a sweeping success, so much so that he'd be tapped to be a judge on the Great American Bake Off. One day while filming in LA, he would run into a distraught Sharpay, who just found out she lost the part of Betty Cooper to Lily Reinhart. He would ask her one more time on a date, and she would realize that his sincerity is what she'd been looking for in a man all along, and they would fall in love and get married. This is what I think would happen to the characters in The Sweet Life if they were real people. Cody would go on to study law and fall victim to nice guy syndrome, so much so that he'd get swept up in a Reddit incel group that planned to disrupt a televised fashion show to convince girls to date them or something. Not realizing that the show was organized by London Tipton, Cody would go. She would disrupt the plans and then convince him that he needs to see a therapist. He would have a breakthrough and then totally switch gears and become a lawyer for women's rights. After graduating high school, London would move to LA. She would lose touch with all of her grounded friends from the series and hang out with a bunch of LA partiers that would just take advantage of her for her money. It gets so bad that she would eventually go to rehab, which at first she resisted, but then she realizes that rich people rehab is really just a networking opportunity. There she would meet a producer named Kevin, who would concoct the idea to make a reality TV show based on her life called Catching Up with the Tiptons. Mosby would eventually be fired from Tipton Enterprises after they realized that his salary was too high. Recognizing that he spent most of his life devoted to the Tiptons, he wouldn't know what to do, spiral for a short period, but he is type A, so he'd pick up bird watching, meet a guy named Lawrence, they'd fall in love, and retire to a cottage together. This is what I think would happen to the characters in The Sweet Life if they were real people. Part 2. Zach would go to Florida State and flunk out in his first semester because of partying girls, and he'd join a scheme of people that were selling fake Disney World merchandise to international tourists. He'd get caught, thrown in jail, because Disney always knows. His mom would be extremely disappointed in him, and that would be the tipping point for him. He'd go to trade school, become a mechanic, and work on the Tiptons Mercedes and make more money than Cody, and Cody would be very jealous. Maddie would become a biology researcher and stumble upon research that vastly improves cancer treatments. Her supervisor would realize this, steal the research, and submit it to the Nobel Peace Prize. He would be nominated, and she would realize this, enlist the help of newly formed Cody to help interrupt the ceremony. They would expose the supervisor, and she would win the hearts of millions. Esteban would come across papers that exposed the Tipton Hotel as a money laundering scheme. He would do the right thing and become a whistleblower, expose the Tipton family, and be fired illegally. He would take the case to court, win, use the money to write a book called All Cooped Up, The Bellhop Story, and use the money to retire and open a chicken sanctuary. This is what I think would happen to the characters in Hannah Montana if they were real people. After going to college and having a falling out with Oliver and becoming more distant from very famous Miley, Lily would realize that she didn't really know who she was because she was too busy helping everyone else with their problems, go through a slew of different majors, eventually drop out, and feel very lost until she saw a flyer for the LA Roller Derby Girls, which she would join, quickly rise through the ranks, fall in love with a girl named Daisy, and they'd open a lesbian bar together called the Garden of Eden. He would begin a plot to franchise the surf shop and put it all along the West Coast. Just about this time, the IRS would catch up to him and realize that he hadn't paid taxes on his revenue for the past 5 years. Just as they were about to arrest him, Jackson would step in, newly with a law degree, and show a loophole where you don't have to pay taxes for 5 years if you have a best friend, because it's Disney. And then he would save the day, Rico would make him part owner in the company, and they'd have a very lucrative business together. The world knowing her secret, no longer being grounded by her double life, Miley would get a big head and go on a celebrity rampage, with moments like throwing up in Kim Kardashian's closet. At a low point, celebrity beef with Perez Hilton. Miley would reach out to Lily and ask her to help her find herself again, which Lily would. Miley would go on to have 3 successful country rock and pop albums and have a show called the Hannah Montana Bonanza. This is what I think would happen to the characters in Hannah Montana if they were real people. Part 2. After he and Lily broke up, Oliver would drop out of college and go for a rap career, which really wouldn't go anywhere. He'd have an emotional call with Miley where she'd tell him that he wasn't really being who he truly was and he needed to embrace himself. He'd then go for a more feminized e-boy aesthetic, put out a single and a homemade video called Just Because I Don't Have a Kitty Doesn't Mean I Don't Know How to Scratch, and he'd go mega viral. He'd also collaborate with Hannah Montana on his second album. Jackson would fall in love with a supermodel that he met one day at the surf shop, but when he talked to her, she'd say that she only dates lawyers. So he'd go to law school for 7 years, get his business law degree, and then come back, and remarkably, she'd still be there, but she'd married a 95-year-old millionaire. But just at that time, Rico was in trouble with the IRS, so Jackson would use his business law degree to get Rico out of trouble, and then they'd become business partners and be very wealthy. Billy Ray and Miley would get in a huge argument when it felt like Billy Ray was more concerned about the profitability of Hannah Montana than Miley's declining mental health. She would also then realize that he was actually taking a way bigger cut as manager than he should have been, and they would have a huge falling out. This would eventually be remedied, though, when they had a duet on their hometown stage, and Billy Ray gave back most of the profits that should have been Hannah Montana's in the first place.